Quetzalcoatl ruled as a god-king so devoted to compassion that he banned human sacrifice in his own city, replacing it with offerings of snakes, birds, and butterflies. His rival wanted the old, bloodier ways back, and rather than fight him directly, tricked him into a single night of shame so total that Quetzalcoatl exiled himself from his own kingdom, walked to the edge of the world, and burned himself alive on a funeral pyre of his own making. His heart rose into the sky as he burned and became the morning star, the planet Venus, visible before dawn to this day, the same light Quetzalcoatl had represented in life, now literal and unmissable. This is the story of one of Mesoamerica's most important deities, the feathered serpent, god of wind, wisdom, and self-sacrifice, and the single drunken night that separated the wise ruler he wanted to be from the man his rival proved he still was underneath it. Quetzalcoatl, the name means feathered serpent in Nahuatl, was one of the most significant deities across Mesoamerica, worshipped for centuries by the Toltecs, later by the Aztecs, and by numerous other cultures throughout the region, each with their own version of his mythology. He was associated with wind and breath, with knowledge and the priesthood, with the arts and the cultivation of maize, and, distinctly among Mesoamerican gods, with the idea that offerings to the gods didn't have to come from human sacrifice at all. In the version of his story tied most closely to actual history, Quetzalcoatl wasn't only a distant sky god, but also a legendary priest-king named Topiltzin, who ruled the Toltec capital of Tollan, known today as Tula, sometime in the 10th century. As Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, he governed as a wise, disciplined priest-ruler who took his own religious vows of purity extremely seriously and who used his authority specifically to move his people away from human sacrifice, replacing it with offerings of snakes, birds, butterflies, and other creatures, a policy that made him beloved by his subjects and reshaped Tollan into a center of art, learning, and relative peace. This put him in direct structural opposition to Tezcatlipoca, Smoking Mirror, a god of night, sorcery, conflict, and fate, whose entire religious tradition depended on the older, bloodier practices Quetzalcoatl had worked to end. Where Quetzalcoatl represented order, discipline, and self-sacrifice, Tezcatlipoca represented chaos, temptation, and the belief that the gods demanded blood, not butterflies. Tezcatlipoca wanted the old ways restored, and he had no intention of waiting for Quetzalcoatl to change his mind on his own. Tezcatlipoca's approach wasn't a direct assault. Quetzalcoatl was too beloved by his people and too disciplined in his own conduct to be overthrown by force or open accusation. Instead, Tezcatlipoca went after the one thing that had always protected Quetzalcoatl's authority: his own unshakable self-discipline, the purity of conduct that made him different from every ruler who had come before him. He arrived at Tollan disguised, and the accounts differ on exactly what form he took: a foreign merchant, an old healer, a stranger with something to offer the priest-king. What every version agrees on is the method. Tezcatlipoca first held up a mirror of polished black obsidian and showed Quetzalcoatl his own reflection, apparently for the first time in a way that let him truly see himself. Whatever the ageless priest-king saw in that reflection, the marks of time, the ordinary humanity beneath the god-king's discipline, it unsettled him in a way nothing else had managed to before. For the first time, he became self-conscious of his own aging, his own physical ordinariness, in a way that cracked something in the total confidence he'd always ruled with. It was a small crack, but Tezcatlipoca wasn't finished, and he had exactly what he needed to widen it: an offer of pulque, framed as medicine, framed as comfort for a suddenly troubled ruler, the fermented drink that Quetzalcoatl, a priest bound by vows of purity his entire life, had never allowed himself to touch. Quetzalcoatl, unsettled and for once willing to accept comfort he would normally have refused, drank the pulque Tezcatlipoca offered. Then he drank more. Each cup, framed as harmless, as medicinal, as exactly what a troubled ruler needed to feel like himself again, pulled him further from the discipline that had defined his entire reign. By the time Tezcatlipoca judged him drunk enough, the trick had one final devastating piece left. In the most widely told version of the story, Tezcatlipoca arranged for Quetzalcoatl's own sister, a priestess named Quetzalcoatl, bound by the same vows of purity he was, to be brought to him and gotten drunk in turn. What followed, in the haze of pulque and manipulation Tezcatlipoca had carefully engineered, was a night neither of them would have chosen sober. Brother and sister, both intoxicated beyond their own judgment, committed an act of incest that violated everything Quetzalcoatl's priesthood stood for. He wasn't awake enough, in the moment, to stop it or fully understand what was happening. He was awake enough the next morning to understand completely. Quetzalcoatl woke to find what he had done, and the horror of it was total. Not because anyone else had witnessed it, not because Tezcatlipoca had engineered every step, but because the man who had spent his entire reign as the living embodiment of discipline, purity, and restraint had just proven, in the space of one manipulated night, that he was exactly as capable of shame and failure as anyone he had ever ruled over. Tezcatlipoca had never needed to overthrow him by force. He only needed Quetzalcoatl to see himself clearly once, get drunk once, and fail once, and let the priest-king's own impossible standards for himself do the rest of the work. Quetzalcoatl could not undo what had happened, and by his own accounting, could not remain in Tallinn and continue ruling as the pure, disciplined figure his people believed him to be. Different tellings describe his grief in different ways. Some say he wept for days, unable to face his own court. Others describe him ordering a stone sarcophagus built and lying in it for 4 days as a kind of living death before finally emerging to leave. He abdicated the throne and left Tallinn, traveling east toward the coast with a small group of followers who refused to abandon him even now. The journey itself accumulated its own legends. That he stopped to test his skill with arrows against distant trees, splitting them clean through. That he buried treasures of gold and jade along the way, rather than let them corrupt whatever ruler followed him. That Tezcatlipoca's agents pursued him even in exile, sending sorcerers and hostile magic to intercept him, unwilling to let their rivals simply walk away and possibly recover his standing somewhere else. Quetzalcoatl pressed on regardless, shedding, city by city, the authority and certainty that had defined his entire reign until he finally reached the eastern coast of Mexico at the edge of the Gulf, with nowhere further east left to walk. There, by the most widely told version of his story, he built his own funeral pyre, and, in an act that mirrored the very principle he had spent his reign trying to teach his people, that sacrifice given willingly meant more than sacrifice taken by force, he set it alight himself and walked into the flames. As Quetzalcoatl burned, his heart is said to have risen out of the flames and into the sky, becoming the morning star, the planet Venus, visible glowing on the eastern horizon just before sunrise, a light he had been associated with since long before this final act gave the association its most literal possible meaning. A parallel version of his departure, told alongside the self-immolation story in different regions and periods, has him building a raft of intertwined serpents instead and sailing east across the ocean rather than burning, vanishing over the horizon with a promise, in some tellings, that he would one day return. That promise became one of the most historically consequential legends in Mesoamerican history, though modern historians treat it with real caution. Spanish chroniclers writing after the conquest of Mexico claimed the Aztec ruler Moctezuma II initially wondered whether Hernán Cortés, arriving from the east in 1519, might be Quetzalcoatl, returning as foretold. Whether Moctezuma actually believed this, or whether the story was shaped and amplified afterward by Spanish writers looking to explain their own conquest as something closer to prophecy than invasion, remains genuinely disputed among historians today. Most now consider the return legend, at least in the specific form tied to Cortés, likely to be a story reshaped after the fact rather than a belief the Aztecs actually held beforehand. What's certain, across every telling, is simpler and older than that. A god-king who built his entire reign on discipline and compassion, undone in a single manipulated night by a rival who understood that the surest way to destroy someone convinced of his own purity is to show him, once, exactly how easily it can be lost. Subscribe if you want more. See you in the next one.